Hi everybody, I'm Kate Fantinel or Lady Liberty. Welcome to Liberty Chat. We have a special episode tonight. We're in Parliament House. It's Monday morning here, but I took the opportunity to have the two men that have held this party up for the last 4 years in Victoria and Australia for that matter. We have David Limbrick from Southeast Metro and Tim Quilty from Northern Victoria. Tim's in town. We did a video shoot last night for a fantastic ABC ad that I can't wait for you to see. And we're going to chat to them about the last 4 years. And before that as well, how did they become libertarians? So I'll start with you, David. How did you become a libertarian?
I first started questioning the role of government after the whole September 11 thing and the response to it. I was really concerned about lots of these anti-terror laws and this sort of thing. And after all of that emergency, a lot of these restrictions on people's freedom stayed, and that made me question a lot of things. And eventually I came around to the idea that there needs to be voices in Parliament, or there needs to be a voice that stands up for liberty. And I looked around in Australia to which parties actually did that, and at the time the only one, and it's still the only one, that stands on those principles was the Liberal Democrats. So I started following them, way back in 2006, 7, something like that. Yeah, but that's basically how I got around to it in the end.
And what about you, Tim? How did you become a libertarian?
So I've always hated people telling me what to do. From being a small child, it's infuriated me. So I don't think anyone has the right to tell me what to do. Then reading some books as a young teenager, mostly Heinlein probably first of all, especially The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. It's a very libertarian book that sort of said this makes sense to me, and then other literature, some Ayn Rand at times and so on, firmly cemented me on my path. So I've been a libertarian almost all my life.
And you were saying just before that you met John Humphrys, the founding father of our party back in 2002 in Canberra. Is that how you came across the Lib Dems?
Yeah, so I was visiting a school friend at the weekend in Canberra when I was back on the farm, and he took me to a party and introduced me to his friend John, who was many of you know, John Humphrys. He's a passionate libertarian, evangelical libertarian, and I said, "Oh, this is the party for me." I thought this would be great. Because I'd previously been a member of the Liberal Party, and I left the Liberal Party in '96. I said, "Righto, that's it. Politics is over for me for life now." And then I met John and heard about the Lib Dems, and said, "Oh, this is great. I could be involved in politics with no chance of ever being elected anywhere. This is ideal." So I signed up.
And little did you know, 2018, when you were first elected, you would be an elected representative for our party. I'll just ask you first, Tim, while you've got the floor, why did you run for politics back in 2018 for Lib Dems? You were a councillor before that, but what made you want to switch to state politics?
Right, so it wasn't the first time I'd run for the party. I ran in the federal elections in 2004, 2007, when we were Liberty and Democracy Party. 2010, I missed the 2013 election because I just started a new job. I ran in 2016, so I ran in what's that, 4 elections or 5 elections for the party as a lower house candidate, knowing I had no chance of winning, but indulging in politics. And politics is a lot more fun when you're the candidate and you have your own voting for yourself on the ballot paper. Yeah. It's nice. I've always had a kick out of it. And then I ran for council and I got elected to council, and that was the extent of my ambitions in politics, was to be a councillor. And then they asked me to run, they need someone to run in Northern Victoria for the party. I said, all right, sure. I have a bit of a profile, I'll do that. And they said, you're not going to win, so that's fine, that's good. And then it turned out I did, but anyway.
And now you're here. What about you, David? Why did you run back in 2018?
Well, I suppose I'm a bit similar to Tim in that I'd run a couple of times before that as well. I first ran in the 2014 election, similar to Tim. Like, I'd only just become active in the party at the time, and they needed someone to run, and they twisted my arm, and I said, yeah, all right, I'll run, and didn't have any chance of winning, but I thought I'd do my part. And then similarly, in the 2016 federal election, I ran in that again, not in a winnable position, but I was trying to help out the party. And in 2018, I didn't think I was going to win either in 2018. But look, all of the times the motivation for me was the same, in that and I'm guessing Tim's the same here as well. We'd seen this long-term creep in government power and restriction on people's lives, and because we'd seen that, we felt very strongly that there needed to be someone pushing back against that. And we thought, if we can push back during elections, that's good. If we can push back, by getting someone elected, then that's great as well. But that was really my motivation, is to push back. Yeah.
So just say David, when he was elected in 2018, I rang him up and told him, I messaged him, and he said, I don't believe it. No. He wouldn't believe it for about an hour or so until the VEC published the results. People ask me why I ran for politics when I had no chance of winning, and I saw that we were sliding down a slope into greater and greater government, and I wanted to be able to say, when it's finished the slide into totalitarianism, that I fought back. I did something. I stood up. So even if I had no chance of winning, I didn't just sit by and let it happen. I would stand up and push back, and that's what I'm still doing, pushing back.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. Like, what motivated me to actually get involved, rather than just watch from the sidelines, was that, you've got a choice. You can sit around at home and complain, or accept the fact that we do live in a society where it's still relatively free and people can get involved and change things through our democratic processes. And like Tim says, if there's this slide going on, you want to be able to say that you did something about it, that you didn't just sit there and watch it happen. And that's what I feel like being involved. It gives you that ability. And of course, if you do get elected, then you get a big chance to be able to push back and do something against it. But yeah, I feel the same way. I didn't want to be just sitting there watching it happen.
I think very importantly, this is what we believed well before COVID. I think COVID woke a lot of people up to the growing power of the state, but it's been obvious for 50 years how the government's growing like a cancer, so we were early in the story.
Yeah.
I've had the privilege and honour of working for every elected Liberal Democrat, from former Senator David Leyonhjelm, Aaron Stonehouse in WA, and now David and Tim in Victoria. And it's a common theme. We don't want to be candidates. I was a candidate. Reluctantly, they twisted my arm, but it's because it's the right thing for us to do, is to be part of the conversation and at the table, when we'd rather have a much smaller table, a much shorter conversation about what the government can tell us to do. So after you got elected, did you guys know each other prior?
Sort of. Like, we'd spoken on the phone and stuff.
I think I'd come down to a one or two party events in Melbourne. I was living in Wodonga at the time. There was no party up there, so I came down once or twice to a branch meeting down here. But we didn't know each other well at all.
Yeah, I mean, I knew your face and you knew mine, and we'd had conversations on the phone and stuff, but yeah, not really.
So how did you get along, and how did you decide to divide up policy areas, or who would say what on what topic? How did that come about, naturally, or?
Oh, no, we consciously talked about it. So when we first got elected, Tim had to come down to Melbourne to organise a whole bunch of stuff, and I said, well, why don't, and my wife and kids were overseas at the time, so I said, why don't you come and stay at my joint, and we can, hang out and do whatever you need to do, and importantly, figure out if there's going to be any differences of opinion on things, because it's better to know early than figure it out later. And so that was pretty good. I needed a spare bed for Tim to sleep in, so we bought a bed from IKEA, flat pack, and made it together. And we didn't have any big arguments, so that was a good omen, I think. And lots of people get very frustrated with IKEA furniture.
Nobody got stabbed with a Phillips head.
Yeah, no one got stabbed with a Phillips head. It was all fine. But I mean, that shows, what it showed though was the strength of the the philosophical foundation of what we believed in was such that even though we didn't really know each other very well, we had very different backgrounds, yet we didn't really disagree on much at all. Certainly nothing significant.
And that's played out over the last 4 years too. We really
pretty much.
There's been some disagreements, but always we argued around on principle and came to a principled position. And there's only that one vote just in the last week or two of Parliament that we voted differently.
And what vote was that?
It was on the timber industry. The government was increasing the penalties for protesters, and I came down on the side of because there's a property rights issue because the land is licensed to the loggers and they have the right to exclude protesters. David came down against giving more power to the government to punish protesters, which after watching 2.5 years of COVID lockdowns was pretty obvious why you do that too.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the rare issues where you can come up with a principled argument on both sides of it. Like, I understood your argument and didn't dispute that it was unprincipled. I think we understood each other's arguments, so it wasn't like it was really just a matter of where we fell, you know, whether you're prioritising property rights or government overreach. And you know, maybe before the pandemic I might have had a similar opinion to you, but the pandemic sort of radicalised me a bit, I think, as it did many people. But yeah, we haven't, like, I think where we've had disagreements, it certainly hasn't been around policy. It's more been around, you know, the way that we talk about things and the way that we frame things, and that's less of a disagreement and more of a discussion process. So, yeah.
Talking about radicalising, I will say at protests before COVID, there was one might be 2019 Economic Forum one, and the police went and roughed up the protesters. I thought, oh, dirty hippies, I'm not that upset about it. But after having gone through COVID, I'm definitely, by not protesting that, we were empowering the police to do what they did. So I'm now much more radicalised against police having any powers to attack protesters.
I mean, I did pay attention to what happened in 2019, and yeah, I wasn't very happy with what the police did then, but yeah, in hindsight, we probably should have spoken up about it more than we did. Everything's easy in hindsight, I suppose, but yeah, we should have spoken up about it more.
We'll go back to the start of 2018, 2019, after you were both elected pre-pandemic. So there were some key moments and key issues that you spoke about: legalising cannabis, solar panel rebates, nuclear power, the bushfires, Wodonga Council issues. What were the main issues that you prosecuted prior to the pandemic that you're proud that you stood up for? We'll start with you, Tim.
It's kind of hard to even remember back to the before times, we call it. So we were new and young and fresh and innocent, and
not wearing good enough suits, or so they said at the start.
The first photo of David and me posted on the day we were sworn in, and we were just talking earlier, we got terrible criticism of our suits. We're saying, you're MPs now, dress properly.
Even though Tim's was a tailored suit, and mine was a pretty decent one, I thought, but anyway.
We've talked about it before. The first big thing that we had a big fight on was when the government was giving themselves the power to take DNA samples from anyone who's...
Again, police overreach, yeah.
And we fought hard, we worked hard, we did engagement with groups. And I think we were about the only ones who voted against in the Parliament. Was it just the two of us?
No, actually Fiona Patton voted against it as well.
The Greens?
I can't remember. I think the Greens might have, and I think there was someone else as well.
Cliff,
yeah, maybe.
Anyway.
I can't remember. So sorry if I missed you, whoever you are. But
so that, and it passed obviously because the government had the numbers. The opposition supported it. Almost everyone supported it because strong police is great apparently. And we felt really crushed and devastated after that.
Yeah.
We worked so hard on it and made no difference. I mean, we did make a difference. We fought on it, but we lost. And that kind of set the tone for what was going to happen going forward on a lot of issues. We fought hard on, and we didn't achieve anything we didn't stop it. Yeah.
There was another really big battle as well in 2019 that we fought, that we felt really strongly about, was the professional engineers registration bill. And I think we sort of took the government by surprise on that one, because they weren't expecting opposition from anyone. But what this bill was doing was effectively making it illegal to call yourself an engineer without getting a license. Previously, you could just call yourself an engineer and you could belong to a professional association and then say, you know, I'm a member of this association or whatever. But they wanted to force you to buy a license effectively to call yourself that. We felt strongly that this was a big inhibitor and a lot of bureaucratic red tape for no particular benefit, and we fought really hard against that and made a bit of a stir in the media. That was like one of the first times that we actually got some decent media coverage, and yeah, I think the government was actually caught by surprise with that one.
I mean, it's not a big cost, but it's symptomatic of the red tape the government wraps everything in, and the whole 4 years the government's been adding red tape and layers of bureaucracy and training organisations you must belong to, and opportunities to clip the ticket. So
Yeah.
All these professional bodies now get to have a take and rake it in, and who knows, perhaps donate to the Labor Party as well. There's a bit of a kickback there. Plastic bags was another one. We had big fight with that. The banning of plastic bags.
We argued that it was pointless because they just, you know, from a resources point of view, it doesn't make any sense. And yeah,
those little thin single-use plastic bags, which people use for the rubbish after they've gone shopping, they are, anyway, we haven't got the figures here, but they're much less environmentally damaging than the reusable bags. You have the woven reusable bags that be used 180 times or something to be less damaging than a single-use plastic bag. You see in rubbish bins now, people are buying the 15-cent ones from Coles and Woolworths, thick plastic ones, and using that in their rubbish. So they're still only using them one time. So they're doing far more damage to the environment. So basically, we made things worse.
Ironically, the cotton ones are the worst. Apparently, they just use massive amounts of water for a cotton one. So there you go. They look nice though.
Was there any issue for you, David, pre-pandemic that you remember prosecuting in the Parliament?
The big one that we fought early on was the DNA collection bill, definitely, and the professional engineers. The other big win that we had in Parliament was we pushed for an inquiry into nuclear prohibition in Victoria. For those of you that aren't aware, Victoria was one of the first states to outlaw pretty much everything to do with the nuclear fuel cycle in Australia. Back in 1983, I think it was under John Cain did it, and we asked for an inquiry into that and succeeded. Beat the government on that one, which was interesting. Yeah, and we got the inquiry up, so that was good.
You mentioned bushfires, and that was obviously the big. We had actually my first speech in Parliament wasn't my maiden speech. I got to talk on the condolence motion on the 2010 fires.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And
no, it was 2009. I think the fires were. Yeah.
Anyway, so I spoke on that and said that I'd be holding the government to account for fire management. And then obviously we had the big fires in 2020 when I spoke on that. And again, I was very angry after I'd been out fighting fires for a few weeks as well, but that massive fire. And there's such mismanagement in the parks, national parks, and basically they're not doing control burns, they're not doing the things they're supposed to do under the Royal Commission after the 2009 fires they agreed to. They just abandoned it. There's junk science they're talking about that lets them get away with it. They're not managing the land at all. Anyway, so fires are a big thing and they remain a big thing. Floods are going to be a big thing as well. We have this city government that's neglecting the whole of regional Victoria.
I'll just ask you about floods now while we bring them up. There is flooding in your electorate, Northern Victoria, at the moment, and you were getting quite fired up at the pub last night about dams and the fact that you were banging the table saying we need to build dams, and the government's response at the time was it's not going to rain enough for us to need them. How are you feeling about that now?
That's not years ago. A few weeks ago I asked a question about dams and the government's response was there are no good sites and there won't be enough rainwater to fill a dam, so they're not going to be a waste of money. and now, obviously, if we built more dams, they'd be full and there'd still be water, big floods down in the river, but we'd be saving water for dry years. There's plenty of opportunity to catch water and reuse it, but we have this ideology that irrigation is bad, and you see it through the Murray-Darling Basin plan, where they're bankrupting farmers and destroying the communities to send all this environmental water down to kill the forests and to run out to sea at the end of the Murray Mouth. It's absolute nonsense, but they have this big bureaucratic machine in process doing all this damage to the environment, to the communities, to the economy. So that's not nuts.
They did build the desal plant though.
And the pipeline to Melbourne. The other issue with flooding is the levee banks all along the river. There are in the past, over the last 100 years, we built a series of levee banks to protect towns, to protect agricultural land, so that we could have floods without destroying crops. Obviously, when a flood gets big enough, it goes over the levee banks. There's nothing you can do about it at some point. But what we've allowed to happen in the last 30 or so years is the levee banks to crumble and collapse. No one's been repairing them. Where it's on Crown land, no one's allowed to repair them. We now have an ideology in DELP that thinks that there shouldn't be anyone farming on the floodplains and they should all get flooded. So this is almost engineered thing for these properties to be destroyed. So you'd think it'd be simple to fix the levee banks, but the government has no will to do so. So after the floods are over, that'll be the next thing to focus on, is let's get the levee banks fixed. And the farmers will do it. Local farmers can maintain their own banks. It doesn't need the government to step in. It just needs the government to allow them to do it. We heard stories of farmers being threatened with prosecution if they went to fix a levee bank anywhere before the floods. So it's crazy.
Another
anti-bush ideology.
Yeah, another issue I want to touch on with you, because our last interview on Liberty Chat, I had to cut you off because you were talking so much, more than I've ever heard you spoke in my life. But the timber industry, which the Andrews government has shut down, also McGowan has done that in Western Australia, where I'm from. Can you just talk a little bit about what's happened in that area in Victoria?
So the Victorian government, and now after the last election, not before, they made the decision before the last election, they held it off until after. They announced the whole timber industry in Victoria, the native timber industry, would be shut down by 2030. And there's in a phase out now. But what's happening, we have all these anti-logging groups, environmental activists taking big forests to court in these series of baseless cases that mostly get thrown out, that is tying up, stopping logging, and the flow of timber to the mills is drying up. And so we have mills that should have been running until 2030 are now shutting down at the end of this year or sometime next year. There's hundreds and hundreds of jobs to be lost from little communities, which are timber towns that depend on the timber. But the government just turned the switch off on that and lets those towns die and blow away. The vision for regional Victoria is, I said this before, is so that people from the cities, public servants in the city, can ride their bikes up the old rail trail and have a cup of coffee in the quaint little village. And people who live there can serve them, and then public servants can go back to the city again. And that's not my vision for regional Australia at all.
What is your vision? Does it rhyme with Brexit?
So we've heard me talk about Rexit, the idea of making new states, cutting out Greater Melbourne and Greater Sydney areas out and merging the rest of regional New South Wales and regional Victoria together to make a super state effectively, with a really strong economy, distributed public service, and no big cities, no dominant areas, and just let us actually thrive instead of sucking us dry. And it's definitely doable, and I hope to see that happen sooner rather than later.
Well, I think Dean McRae from New South Wales would love to have a Brexit in a little area with you, Tim. Now I want to move on to some darker times. The pandemic. So March 2020, the pandemic was declared a state of emergency in Victoria. At that time, none of us really knew what was going to happen. When did you realise or think this isn't right? Was it how long did it take for you two to have the discussion? We should really be pushing back and saying, hang on, how long are we going to keep kids out of schools for? How long are we going to force people to work from home? How long are we going to keep businesses closed? How long are we going to keep the border closed? At what point after March 2020 did the both of you start having that conversation privately?
I think we started having the conversation like really early. We said like, you know, how long can we let this go on for?
We were alarmed at the use of emergency powers, coming so soon after they'd been used during the bushfires. But at the same time, we were all watching the videos out of China where people dropping dead in the streets and this massive emergency. No one knew how bad COVID was going to be. And so we didn't want to push too hard right at the start because maybe it really was airborne Ebola. It was going to kill 3/4 of the world's population. Obviously, it wasn't that. We knew a month or two in, it wasn't as bad as it was being made out to be. And the restrictions just kept getting harder and harder, tighter and tighter, stupider and stupider. Even as we knew as we learnt the virus was getting less and less dangerous.
It's the thing that was evident early on was that it didn't really affect children that much, right? That was the thing that, you know, it's very, you know, they said, oh, the virus doesn't discriminate. Well, it actually really does discriminate. It harms older people and people who are sick much more than children. And so it raises the very serious ethical question, you know, locking children up in their homes and not sending them to school in order to protect other people. Is that an ethical thing to do? And, you know, if you're doing it for a couple of weeks or something, well, maybe that's worthwhile. But when it sort of started dragging on and on and on, you know, we had no idea that they were going to continue doing this for years, right? If we had known that from the start, we would have had pushback from day one. But yeah, I think it was around April where we actually started speaking out against it, and then we just got louder and louder and louder.
When they made the mask compulsory, I think that was the first big pushback we gave. At that point, we had 80% compliance voluntarily. 80% of people were wearing their masks, and then the government said, no, it's compulsory, you must wear it. And never tried, they didn't ask or persuade. As soon as they had decided they were going to do it, they made it mandatory and enforced it at gunpoint. And it was when the power was going to their heads, and it just got worse after that.
I think that was my biggest criticism. I don't think that we didn't object to them managing the pandemic. What we were objecting to was the use of force the whole time, right? And everything that they did using force. So everything from masks right through to vaccines, everything. What we would have preferred is that they did a whole lot of public education and try and persuade people using, you know, rational persuasion. And this is what some countries did, not a lot, but I've spoken many times about Japan. They had very few restrictions other than their border closures and some trading hour restrictions. Sweden as well, they were panned early on, but you know, and it's looking now like they made the right decisions and we made the bad decisions.
The very bad decisions.
Very bad decisions, yeah.
Well, one of the very bad decisions that I know both of you are very passionate about is the closure of the schools. And David, you tweeted really early on questioning, is this the right thing to do? Like, people's children are suffering. You had phone calls in your office, and Tim, so did you, especially regarding when the border was closed, trying to get across if they went to school just across the border in New South Wales. What do you think is going to be the long-term effects of those school closures? Is that something you want an inquiry into in the next term of government, or what can we do to fix what's been done?
Well, I think we've called for a Royal Commission many times on the response to the pandemic, and you know, I think we need to learn from some of these mistakes, if they were indeed mistakes. You know, I believe that shutting the schools was a mistake, but I questioned very early on the long-term consequences of what they were doing with taking kids out of school, because there's very good research, and there has been for many, many years, on the long-term, lifelong consequences of disrupting a child's learning. That's very well known amongst educators, and all of a sudden we had all of the kids at home and not going to school. Now they were doing this remote learning, but you know, I saw it in my own kids. how much it disrupted them. And you know, my family was in like an almost perfect situation where, you know, mum was staying at home with them, looking after them, and you know, got two parents, and you know, we had enough money to buy computers or whatever we needed for them. But lots of families weren't in that situation. Like, parents were struggling, or maybe their business had been crushed by the lockdown. You know, maybe they had alcohol or other drug issues. Maybe their parents had divorced. And for a lot of these families, it's very, very hard maintaining it, even for a short time, let alone long periods of time. And as it dragged on, we saw the effects of that through the people contacting our office. It was, you know, it just turned into a tidal wave of people. Yeah.
In the best case, we wasted at least a year's education for every kid, just with over the year and a half or whatever it went on. We lost at least a year's education there. In the worst case, we've had suicides, we've had mental health issues, we've had behavioural issues, disruptions, and the impact of that on kids' development is going to be, we're going to be dealing with it in 20, 30 years' time still.
Yeah, and there's a lot of unknowns as well. Like, I mean, you know, we haven't done this before, and so some things are going to be predictable, like, you know, interruptions to your learning is going to have predictable effects. But like you said, the mental health consequences, the physical consequences, like just for health. I was actually shocked, like when we came out of one of the lockdowns, I went swimming at the pool with my kids. There was fat kids everywhere. Like, I mean, but like kids, I mean, so many people put on weight during the pandemic, and to see,
and didn't lose it.
Yeah. Oh well, you know, I'm the same. But I mean, to see young kids, so many young kids running around that were overweight, was quite shocking. Like,
we had all these years of campaigns about kids' health and sporting, and then we locked them up and said, you're not allowed to do sport, you're not allowed to do anything, stay at home, eat. And the impact from just from people getting fat, kids and adults, health-wise, is probably going to dwarf the impacts of COVID. The deaths that will come out of that.
Yeah, and alcohol consumption for adults, like, I mean, you know, I ended up drinking more than I normally do, and I'm not alone there, I know that. Like, you know, it was a bit of a joke that, you know, one of the few places you could go to buy anything was Dan Murphy's. So, you know, I don't know what sort of long-term effects that's going to have, but I imagine it's not good. But yeah, I mean, looking at it positively though, a lot of kids, when they look back on this, I think they're going to be angry about it. Like, you know, older kids are already angry about it. They're like, you know, this is bullshit. Like, a lot of them are saying that, right? You know, what happened to us, you know? And actually the cruelest thing that I saw that they did to kids, and thankfully they backed off, was when they brought in mandates for teenagers, right? And all of a sudden teenagers couldn't go to retail stores. You know, thankfully they backed off on that a bit, but that was one of the cruelest, nastiest things that I've ever seen a government do.
We had the stories of teenagers trying to shop for school uniforms, being forced to change the clothes outside the shop because they weren't allowed in.
Yeah.
Is that because of vaccine mandates or mask
vaccine
mandates?
Yeah, and when they closed down the playgrounds, like, you know, because the mums were chatting with each other and having a coffee. I mean, yeah, it was an attack on the kids, but it was also an attack on the mums. And, you know, the mums copped it so bad, like having to do all of that stuff, like trying to manage. A lot of them were working from home as well, trying to manage what the kids were doing with their school and all the problems associated with that. And then a bunch of them were just, you know, going out to the park once a day and having a sneaky chat with their friends. And then the government says, no, you can't be going.
Did not like that.
Yeah, you can't be going out and having a chat. So they closed down the parks, and that's when Tim and I flipped our lids and ended up protesting out the front. But you know, thankfully they backtracked on that pretty quick as well.
I think it had something to do with Dan Andrews' opinion numbers dropping dramatically suddenly. Everyone was all right when he was keeping us safe and locking someone else up, but once they closed the parks, there was a real backlash.
You don't mess with the mums.
I just want to talk about closing the parks for a moment. So last night you recreated the scene on the steps of Parliament House from August 2021 when you did indeed sit on the steps of Parliament with the sign saying "Let kids play, open the parks," and one of our candidates, Anthony Curcio, sent you a box of donuts because it was the first time he saw people standing up for us. You said, David, that you didn't actually get any mainstream media coverage from that protest at the time.
No.
Can you believe that?
Yeah.
Because it resulted in the parks being opened.
There was some, I don't know, like it might have been a newspaper article or something, but where it went crazy was on social media. It went absolutely nuts. So
there was a Herald Sun journalist turned up. I think as the police were getting ready to arrest us, they tipped off a journalist to go up and take a photo. But as that got diffused and the police realised that they actually had no power to touch us, he just took a photo and went home again, and didn't turn up. For months, that photo.
Speaking of getting arrested, I do have to ask you, David, about when you were arrested on Melbourne Cup Day. You did a video about that recently on the anniversary. Do you still feel a little bit triggered when you see a police officer, or when you're walking where that took place? Does it still sit very firmly in your mind that day?
it seems like a different world. You know, when we were standing out there the other day, you know, there was people taking wedding photos, and you know, people use the front of Parliament for wedding photos because it's a nice backdrop and stuff, and people were going out about their business. So it does seem like a different world and a different time that we lived in, and in many ways it was. But what we've got to remember is that it happened, and that, you know, we've got to remember how far government will go if you let them, because that's what we've seen. You know, if you give them the chance, they really will close the parks. They really will, you know, use coercion against your kids. They really will shut your business down. They'll do everything.
House arrest.
Yeah, they'll lock you in your own house. Like, they're capable of anything, and that's why we need people to stand up against them.
And you see the police enforced it all. Almost very few police pushed back against it. Very few quit. When I see police, I always think about them opening fire on protesters, on attacking protesters. So no, I'm not going to say that I was the biggest lover of police before time, but now I'm always triggered when I see police.
But I would say this though, that the chief health officer and the public health orders that they made, I thought it was very deceptive how they sort of hide the fact that everything that they do will have to be enforced by the police. You know, every mandate that they come up with, that, you know, you have to put a mask on or whatever, ultimately needs to be enforced by, you know, men with guns. And we saw that, and we saw the police, you know, that horrible footage of that woman getting a mask shoved on her face and these sort of things. And everyone blames the police because they're the ones doing it. And yes, they were doing it, but they were doing it under the direction of the public health officials, right? That's what we've got to keep in mind, is the police were enforcing this, but they weren't directing it. It was directed by the public health officials.
Another thing that happened during the pandemic, of course, was the Emergency Powers Bill debate in December 2021, 21-hour debate. And I remember the vision of you afterwards, David. You got very emotional and upset. I assume you did as well, Tim, but you're a tough country man, and countrymen don't cry.
In that photo, we've got David being consoled by Catherine, and I'm on my phone. I'm tweeting the past. I was taking my fury out on my phone.
I guess it's something we mentioned earlier is you did fight a lot for different things at the beginning before the pandemic, and it does get a bit hard sometimes, not always winning, and I saw that in the Senate with David Leinhelm, but at least we had that on the record. And in WA with Aaron Stonehouse, we put the Libertarian position on the record, and we put the government on alert that the Libertarians are here and we're principled, and this is our view on whatever issue of the day. When it came to Emergency Powers Bill and the things that came up in that, egregious human rights in WA, they've just passed theirs, and it's actually scary how much it will infringe on civil liberties. Is that something that you would put back on the table when you're re-elected to try and change what they've got in that law that passed?
Yeah, well, we've already had one attempt at this. Tim introduced a private members bill on the previous state of emergency powers, and what we attempted to do there was to put strict limitations on both timeframes and accountability mechanisms for if human rights were found to be breached. In fact, make it a criminal offence, which we thought would make people think twice before signing these orders.
So it was potentially that ministers and public health officials who propose these things, if they're not justifiable, they would end up going to prison. So,
but we certainly need better restrictions on better safeguards on emergency powers. So things like restricting the amount of time that they can be used for. Things like better accountability, better transparency, so that people understand, what's actually being used for. I think, some people have said, "Oh, would you repeal the pandemic bill?" I think just a repeal doesn't really work because the powers that they had before were terrible too. So I think that it needs a total review and overhaul of these sort of emergency powers.
So we want a royal commission.
Yeah.
We want a royal commission into the pandemic, because unless you think that everything we did was perfect, we could do something. Almost everyone, except possibly Dan, thinks that things could have been done better. We won't know how it could be done better unless we do a proper review of it. So we need a review. I think most things were done terribly. We need a review with real powers, a real investigative authority to go into it and find out exactly what we did wrong and exactly why we did it wrong, and who did it.
I think that the government underestimates the public in many ways, because they underestimated them in terms of their ability to be persuaded by rational argument, but they also underestimate them in terms of, how much they can understand about, what's actually going on. So, I just feel that what they did with the emergency powers was just totally wrong. And yeah, we need a royal commission into it.
Maybe they should not have emergency powers at all, full stop.
It'd be a lot safer. But, like the original emergency powers were meant to run for a maximum of only 6 months. So they had a time frame built into it, but then they just legislated to extend the time frame, which is sort of playing on cheat mode, really, isn't it? It's,
I just want to ask about two specific issues for both of you, not related to the pandemic, but something that stood out from me watching the last 4 years. Tim, I'll start with you. Regza. So we've touched upon it briefly before, but you genuinely believe that taking away, decentralising power from Melbourne so that the regions have more control over their area is the way forward to ensure the constituents in your region are best looked after by government.
In fact, it's the only way. We've now reached this. The cities have always had too much power, and because they have the power, they've been feeding themselves and growing themselves. So the capital cities, but now they've become like black holes. They've crossed over event threshold, whatever, the event horizon, and now it's inevitably sucking everything to the city. And because it's 75% of the voters in Victoria now live in Greater Melbourne, they can get away with turning off regional Victoria, and it doesn't matter. It's cheaper that way. They don't have to build hospitals in the regional area if they can build one in the city and make all the people come here for it. They don't have to have trains that run because everyone lives in Melbourne. They can spend $200 billion building the suburban rail loop, but there's no money at all to fix the regional tracks at all. And there's no incentive for the government to change that because the votes of the regions don't matter. The only way to change that is to decouple the regional areas from the city. When they wrote the Australian Constitution, they put in a mechanism to make new states. They absolutely expected us to do that as the population of the country grew and we populated the inland, but in fact we've done the opposite. We've depopulated the inland and moved them into the city. So the only way we can turn that around is by setting the regional economies free, the people free, and people are the economy. So we can actually have thriving industries in the regional areas, jobs that people will come to, jobs that people can stay for, a small distributed public service that's spread out across the whole area, rather than having it all focused in Melbourne, and people keeping their own money. And the other big advantage of Brexit is actually getting to rewrite a constitution and put a proper Bill of Rights into it. One of our policies at this state election is a Bill of Rights, and I think we'll talk about that a bit more. But it's really hard. Going to be really hard to get that up at a referendum. To get a proper Bill of Rights, first we'll get it written, get it up to a referendum, then get it passed. If we start a whole new state, we can do it from scratch, and we can put proper rights in there right from the start, and actually have a state where people's rights are respected.
We do have fantastic candidates in the other regional areas. Julie McGrath in Western Regional Victoria and Robert Cathy in Eastern Regional Victoria. It would be great to have more Lib Dem regional voices in Parliament. I'm from country South Australia, so I love talking to you about these issues, Tim. David, an issue that was very close to your heart and I know very sensitive to you is the issue of Paul Denyer. And on the weekend you were at an event in Frankston talking about this issue. Can you just explain to people why, as a Libertarian politician, you're calling for this person to be locked away for life?
Yeah. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, there was an issue, the Frankston serial killer back in 1993 murdered 3 women and attempted to murder another one. She got away. And he was originally sentenced to 3 life terms plus 8 years with no parole period. And everyone was happy with that at the time, felt it was justice. And then there was an appeal. Now, for technical reasons, which I won't bother going into, but basically the appeal succeeded and a non-parole period of 30 years was set. So that doesn't mean that the sentence was reduced, but it does mean that the possibility of release was put there. That 30 years ends next year, and we've only found out recently that he's actually applied for parole, and that hearing will happen next year. And so there's many people in the Frankston community and many people beyond that who are very concerned about this and want their voice to be heard. And so there's petitions, there's been a documentary. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend it. I'm actually in it, No Mercy, No Remorse. It's on Stan. And then last weekend, one of the people in that, the crime writer, John Sylvester, and Charlie Pizzini, who was one of the policemen who worked on the case at the time, 30 years ago, or 29 years ago, they did like a stage show. There was about 400 or 500 people there, and they sat on stage and talked about the case, but then they actually had some edited footage of the police interview with Denyer, and where he described what he did to those 3 women. And to answer your question, you know, as a Libertarian, I defend the principle of liberty, but even Libertarians would know that there's a very, very small proportion of people who are so dangerous that they should not be allowed. You know, very, very, very tiny number of people who are so dangerous that they shouldn't be amongst the rest of people. And if anyone meets that definition, it's the Frankston serial killer. And you know, I'm happy if people want to try and convince me, but I haven't had anyone put up their hand and say he's changed, or he could change, or he's not going to be a danger. I don't think there's anyone out there who's going to put up their hand and say that. So, you know, I think this is a really important issue, and that's why we're speaking out about it, and you'll probably hear more about it, you know, in the next few months as well.
Turning our minds to the next 3 weeks, there is an election around the corner, 26th of November. What's at stake for the Lib Dems? We've got 2 seats at the moment. I've been in WA when we lost our only representation during COVID, and I've seen the result of not having a voice. It's terrifying. So what's at stake for the Liberal Democrats at this election? Is it more important than the last one, more important than the federal election? What are we thinking?
I think it's much more important than the federal election, mainly because this is where, we've had parliamentary representation since 2013, and we want to continue so that there is a voice in some parliament in Victoria or in Australia that's speaking out in defence of liberty. And we're very conscious of the fact that if we don't succeed in re-election, that there'll be a break in that chain of representation. So that's the pessimistic side. But on the positive side, I think we have built up a fairly large base of support, and I think that our chances of getting re-elected are quite reasonable, and potentially even getting some friends here as well, which I would be very, very happy about. I say to a lot of people, imagine if we had 3 or 4 of us over the last couple of years instead of just 2. Things would have been quite different. Things would have been very different.
Of course, Tim was left very lonely when you had to step down for a little bit to run for the Senate. How did you find being alone in Parliament, and can you imagine what it would be like for others to be alone there?
So I have joked that it did turn out David was doing something, if it wasn't obvious, because once he was gone, I was running around non-stop. There was no breaks, trying to monitor the chamber, trying to do stuff back in the office. So yes, I definitely miss David, and it's hard for 2 MPs, us working together to try and keep on top of what the government's doing. There's so much legislation being pushed through so quickly with so little lead time. With one of us, it would be really impossible, and I pity the single member parties.
Yeah, I've got a lot of a newfound respect for single member parties, and for when Senator Lionhelm was in as well. I imagine that would be very difficult because you've got the obvious just workload stuff of like being able to cover for each other and that sort of thing, but then you've also got the ability to discuss things, right? And we can discuss things, and you don't have to be solely the only person responsible. You can discuss it and say, well, does this make sense or whatever, and it makes a big difference. I've
joked that we're good cop, bad cop with the Labor Party. David is reasonable, and I'm not. From time to time, but absolutely, it's so valuable to have someone there to bounce ideas off, to keep us on the same track. If I hadn't had David here for 4 years, I probably would have been wandering off into the weeds from time to time, and I have a lot more sympathy for other people who've been there by themselves, who maybe took a wrong step somewhere. It was easier to do, so having the 2 of us would get each other on track.
And the other interesting thing is, I'm a city MP and Tim's regional, but we're not a city party or a regional party, and I think it's actually been really good to show that we have a vision for regional and city areas, treating each other as equals and partners rather than being controlled from Melbourne, which I'm very sympathetic to what's been happening in regional Victoria, being controlled by bureaucrats in Melbourne. I think the idea of decentralising that is great, and we should have an equal relationship with regional Victoria. We shouldn't see them as poor second or anything. They should be on equal terms.
Well, how do we differ to other minor parties? So I get this question a lot as well, and so do our volunteers out on the ground. So why should people vote for the Liberal Democrats as opposed to one of these other minor parties? Tim, I'll start with you.
We have a constant belief in liberty. We have a philosophy that stands behind us. So other MPs from minor parties have no real backing behind them, no philosophy behind them. They could vote any direction on any given day. Liberal Democrats have had a very clear vision right from the go. We've been around since 2001 as a party, and we've not shifted our direction or our goals or our aims at all in 21 years. So we will deliver on. We will always stand for freedom, and we'll deliver on it.
One thing from former Senator David Leyonhjelm's office we got a lot was that sometimes the government didn't even come to talk to us to ask or try and persuade us to vote something because they knew that we would vote on our principles, never to vote for an increase in taxes or a reduction in liberty. So I think that's something to be proud of. David, what's your pitch for why people should vote for Lib Dems as opposed to one of the other options on the table?
Look, I think lots of people are sympathetic to what we're saying around this slow march increase of government power, and they look around and see other people and they think, oh, well, you know, there's lots of different ways of fighting back against it. What I'd say is that if you want to fight against an ideology like, you know, the left or Marxists or whatever you want to call it, you need something solid on the other side to push back with, right? And that's what we've got, is we've got our own philosophy, libertarian philosophy, which is in opposition to that. And so I think that, you know, if you want to push back against this, you need some sort of solid foundation to build on. And that's what I feel that we've got, that we can do, you know, we can be dependent on to do that.
If you look at the so-called conservative parties in Australia or around the world, there's very little philosophy behind it. They want to just keep things the way they are now, which means they're now passionately defending the things that they were imposed 30 years ago by the left, and they fought against passionately at the time. Now they're passionately defending it against further change. Someone joked that a conservative is just a leftist driving at the speed limit instead of accelerating. But yes, so they don't really believe in anything.
We do believe in a lot of things, and we've got 10 policies we're taking to the election, including one in relation to treating Victorians as adults. David, do you just want to give a summary of what that policy entails?
Yeah, so it's actually a class of a collection of policies, treat Victorians as adults, but what it's really about is acknowledging the fact that Victorians should have control over their own lives. Specifically, they should have control over their own bodies, right? So things like things like, for example, whether or not they choose to vape. I'm not saying vaping's good, but it is a means through which many people have given up cigarettes, and you know, that seems like a reasonable option, so they should be allowed to have that option. Similarly with mandates, we think that you know, people should be able to make decisions themselves in conjunction with their doctor, free from coercion. Similarly with cannabis, it's the same idea. We think that people should, you know, the government shouldn't be forcing you to take medicine, and conversely, they shouldn't be stopping you taking medicine that you choose to take. That should be up to the individual to make their own choices. Yeah.
And another one as part of that, Tim, is unlock public lands, which is something that affects regional areas. Can you just give the listeners a pitch on why we should unlock public lands?
So we're seeing this government increasingly turning Crown land into so state forests, going into nature reserves or into national parks and so on. There's this constant ratcheting up of protection, of so-called protection of land, which is actually all about locking people out, stopping uses of it. So they're banned. So, and you see, so the timber industry is obviously being locked out, shut down. Prospecting, people just out looking for gold, is being squeezed out.
Rock climbing.
If you can think of a sport that has zero impact, it's people, the rock climbers, who climb up and then carefully they even rub their own chalk off when they come down again if they use chalk.
They have clean-up days, some of them, yeah.
And rock climbers are, generally speaking, very switched on, environmentally conscious people spending time in the bush doing no damage. But that's banned.
Not everywhere, but in
almost
certain areas,
every rock climbing, 99% or 90+% of places to climb in Victoria, that's been banned. Bushwalking is going to be banned. If you get straight off the tracks, they're going to fine you. If you touch a rock, they're going to fine you. If you go swimming, they're going to fine you. You can't collect wood, firewood from anywhere. They don't want to leave it there so it'll burn in big bushfires. So there's this whole ideology in play that we have this pristine natural wilderness that should be untouched by human hands. this does not exist in Australia. Humans have been shaping the bushland here for 60,000 years at least, and it needs management. Land cannot be locked up and left. It falls to pieces. Weeds take over, fires destroy it. So the Crown land, it's our commons. It belongs to Victorians, and Victorians should have access to it. That's basically the pitch.
So both of you have had 4 years in Parliament now.
Oh, I should. Sorry.
Sorry, Tim.
No, I was forgetting the. What was I going to say? Oh, so we had some costing on our policy of turning some national park back into state forests by the PBO. It hasn't been released yet, but I'll just tell you this. We asked what's the cost of turning national park into state forest, and it's huge. There's a massive jump in the cost. And we say, why is that? And they say, oh, what if it's national park? You lock it up and leave it and do nothing with it. There's nothing spent on it. It's left. Whereas if it's state forest, it actually has to be actively managed, and that's really expensive. So when you hear the government making national parks, what they're really doing is cutting spending on Crown land.
That's a good point to make. So 4 years you've had in Parliament, 2.5 of that has been spent dealing with the pandemic. You're both responsible for seeing the party grow so much in Victoria, and I would say nationally too. A lot of people in WA and South Australia and New South Wales comment on you two and everything that you've done. Obviously, you didn't get to do everything you wanted to do in your first term because of COVID. So what's on the agenda when, not if, when you're both re-elected on November 26th this year? David, I'll start with you.
Look, I think one of the first things is to move forward on protection of rights. Now, longer term, we've said that we'd like to have a Bill of Rights. As Tim alluded to earlier, that's a long-term project. But I do think that in the short term, we can strengthen up the Charter, the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. I think there's a lot that we could do there to strengthen that up. As I've made public many times, throughout the pandemic, I've been very disappointed with the performance of the Charter and its actual protections when they've been tested. So I think that we could put forward a private member's bill on that. There was actually a review into the Charter's operation a few years ago. None of the recommendations from that review have been enacted, is my understanding. But I think definitely that needs to be one of the first things. Also looking at, if there is a Royal Commission into COVID and the response to it. I know there's a federal one. I'd like to see one at a state level as well, but if there's not going to be one at a state level, we should push for it, and at the very least get Victoria, what happened here included in that response.
Tim, what's on your agenda?
So we talked about the Royal Commission into COVID. I'd also like to see a Royal Commission into police force, and into government links to the police force, and the way that the Labor Party has intertwined itself with the police, with the public service, with the judiciary in Victoria. And so it's like little tentacles have gone right through public society. And we saw Queensland had the Fitzgerald Royal Commission back in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s. The New South Wales had the Wood Royal Commission into police corruption, and had massive turnovers. Victoria has never had one, or certainly not any time recently. There's no proper oversight. There's been no investigation of the police force and government links with it, and corruption in general. And we desperately need that to happen. So part of our platform is honest government, and is pushing for a Royal Commission.
So what can people watching do to help get you two and more Lib Dems re-elected?
Well, firstly, you can like and share our content on social media, but
which is actually really valuable.
Which is actually really valuable because it reaches more people. But if you'd like to get involved at a more grassroots level, you can get involved very quickly because there's going to be pre-poll soon. If you're not familiar with what pre-poll is, effectively in Victoria, you can vote early in the election. You don't have to wait until election day. And that means that there's a number of locations where we need people helping with how to vote cards and things like that. So if you'd like to get involved in that, then please contact our office. You can, and we can organise that.
And that starts on Monday. So
Yeah, it starts on Monday next week, yeah. And Then, of course, on election day itself, there'll be a lot more locations on election day than pre-poll. So yeah, as much help as we could get with that would be wonderful.
There will be, I haven't counted them, but there will be thousands of polling booths just in northern Victoria. The chances of manning them all is low, but the more volunteers we get, the more we can man. I was saying, at the 2018 election, we manned 3 polling booths in northern Victoria. It was me in Wodonga, we had someone in Ballarat, in Bendigo, and someone in Shepparton. I can't really remember where they were, but that was it for on election day. This time we will man dozens or hundreds. We won't man them all, but the more we can man, the better.
Yeah.
Anything you can do to help to keep these 2 men in Parliament and more Liberal Democrats elected is appreciated. vic.ldp.org.au is where you go for information on our policies, and if you want to sign up to volunteer, or if you want more information about our party in Victoria. Thank you so much for indulging me in this special edition of Liberty Chat today. You're both heroes of mine, and I pinch myself every day coming to work for the both of you. You're credited with growing the party in Victoria. The silver lining is that it came through a pandemic, but here we are. Thank you for everyone who's involved in the party in Victoria. It's a great place to be, and I'll just read out the authorisation so we don't get in trouble with the BEC. Authorised by R. Westgarth, Liberal Democratic Party, 117757 Burke Street, Docklands, Vic 3008. Thank you for watching Liberty Chat.